You cannot have relationships without spending time with people. You cannot be friendly without having friends. Meaning, if you're not investing constantly in keeping in touch, caring for others, making time for other people, you will not have people in the future when you need them.
Jeffrey Hall, professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas and the co-author of The Social Biome.
I am not asking you to be a super communicator with tons and tons of social contact. Once a month, meeting face-to-face with people that you deeply care about, prioritizing friendship. Once a week, checking in or talking to somebody that could be face-to-face or could be on the phone. Every single day, treating someone with compassion and having a conversation, and sprinkling throughout your days moments of care and concern for the people around you. And I'm not even asking you to do it for strangers or, people who you have no idea. I'm not asking that. I'm asking you to do it with the people who you're already talking to and you already ostensibly like. So I don't think I'm making a big ask, but I feel like the problem of convincing people that social obligation is the right way to live is very, very hard.
People suffering from depression, it could be that they just choose the phone to go to. Like they could have chosen something else, but the phone is there and it's the easiest one, so that's what they choose. It's not that the phone is causing the depression. It's actually on contrary, that it's an easy outlet.
You are correct. I think one of the strongest arguments, at least the ones that I'm compelled by, is that this is a case of reverse causality. The reason that I think that this is quite plausible is that if we look at the research on television and we say who has 12 hours a day to spend in front of a TV, it's people very lonely. It's people who don't have a job and they don't have meaningful alternatives in life. They lack friends, or maybe they lack mobility, right? They're stuck in their home. Is that the case that all of those things are associated with loneliness? Absolutely. In fact, some of the largest studies that have looked at what is associated with depression and loneliness, those are the things, right? Feeling disconnected, meaningless, that you have really very little to do with your lives and ample time. Would people in those times turn to media? There is unequivocal evidence that they do.
Bonded by Science, proudly presented by Noble Blocks.
Thank you, Jeffrey, so much for being here and joining us on Bonded by Science. And actually, I realized I forgot to ask you, do your friends and colleagues call you Jeff or Jeffrey?
Yeah, I have that. The Jeffrey name there is partly because there are lots of Jeff Halls out there. So I actually use the full Jeffrey A. Hall because I'm not even the only Jeffrey A. Hall that got a PhD in 2007. So it's a super common name.
It's a very competitive environment for you, Jeffrey.
I'm trying to be the number one Jeff in the United States. I'm working at it.
All right, let's do that. I mean, it's also important for your book too, right? That they get the right Jeff.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I actually found you quite easily. So that's maybe reassures your confidence. So one of the things that really, triggered my interest in you was I came across one of your recent articles, the 10 myths about social media. I don't think that's the exact title, but I actually really like the title that you chose, and for a number of reasons. And so if I just read it out, so it's like the 10 myths about the effect of social media use on well-being. And then when I went through the article, I thought, oh, this really, is really interesting because you built it up like how I would expect, someone that was, begging for me to like click on something. And then that's what got me. So I thought, okay, this guy really has a lot of like deep thought, because I felt it was ironic in the sense of like playing into the myth that you talk about in the paper. So I was quite curious to wonder how much time you spent considering that title, and did the reviewers give you any pushback on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, in fact, I think because that the title was provocative, the special anniversary issue editor wanted me to have it. The reviewers didn't give me any pushback. Part of the reason that I also did it was, as you say, it's kind of ironic that I'm actually pushing back against clickbaity, harms-based discourse around social media while writing a 10 myths paper about how all that clickbait is wrong. So yeah, I did do it partly for that reason, but honestly, I did it for two reasons: one academic and one more for the sake of trying to explain things to an audience. The academic reason was that, I've actually had papers, particularly written by statisticians, that are like, here are the 10 most common mistakes people make when reporting statistics, or here are the 10, things I read when I'm serving as a reviewer that always drive me crazy. And so don't make these mistakes. And I've kept those articles in the past because I found them very, very useful for making sure that I'm kind of checking the box of doing the best practices when reporting stats. So I knew that there was an academic tradition of actually writing in that form. But the other one was for what you say. One of the things that I have become very frustrated with over the last 2 or 3 years is that the quality of the claims have gotten very poor. They weren't particularly great to begin with when it came to issues around social media and harms of social media, but they've gotten worse, in my opinion, I think in part because people feel very upset and they're trying to find something to blame. They're trying to find some sort of cause for alarming statistics around teen suicide ideation or otherwise. And they've also gotten really intense, partly because of the publication of books and certain academics who have been promulgating these ideas.
Yes, and I would definitely like to unfold some of those myths because you did a really good job. I like the structure that you used also, and I think maybe this is what you were alluding to earlier when you had these prior papers that because of their structure, they became super useful. So I see this paper as being very, very useful for policymakers or for people that want to hold policymakers accountable for the future decisions that they may consider making. So like the first myth, for example, I'll just read it out. So there is undeniable evidence that time spent on social media has a toxic effect on its users. Now, every parent wants to know the answer to that question. So please, Jeff, please explain it.
Yeah, I took that quote actually directly out of a podcast that we're talking about, kind of broader issues of whether loneliness as it's grown for young adults, whether social media is to blame. And that quote is almost verbatim from that podcast where an academic who was discussing things around mental health was like, I'm absolutely convinced of this data. So every one of these myths I tried to take from op-eds, from podcasts, from policymakers' comments to anything that I could find in the kind of the broader community of discourse. I wanted to sort of capture and say, this is an argument. What does the evidence say? And the answer is, does the evidence say no, that if there is an effect, it's very, very small and it's not undeniably toxic. In fact, among the positive associations that we see with social media use and well-being, you include things like sense of connection, frequency of communication with friends and family, opportunities to feel hedonism, which is just basically, this is really fun. I enjoy this.
Good.
Right, exactly. It feels good, which is the same reason we're attracted to television and movies and video games. Media is in very much a hedonistic, pleasurable thing to do. So the negative effects, if you believe the claim of it being undeniably toxic, should be huge, right? They should be very, very big effects and undeniably strong. But overwhelmingly, the studies are suggesting that the effects are very small. And what I mean that is, statistically speaking, they're accounting for very little variance in the negative outcomes associated with social media use. So this first myth is just not true.
It's just simply not true.
Simply not true. There is no undeniably toxic effect.
You never hear any claims on media about all the positive things that social media is bringing you.
No, and in fact, they're often kind of brushed aside as being sort of a pointless kind of a sideshow or a distraction from the real harms. And if people bring up positive things, they often say this in the sort of sense of, well, there are some positive things, or they're sort of like, oh, maybe I buy some of that. But what's odd about that, I think, in terms of the way that we frame these arguments, is that when you're making claims about negative effects, you have to actually look at what people themselves who are social media users say. And they say, yeah, it's a time suck, but it's also really fun. They say, yeah, I wish I could do a little less of it, but I actually get a lot out of it. And if I wasn't on social media, I wouldn't know what my friends and family are doing, and that would be a loss. So what's fascinating to me is that when you brush aside all the positive things, it's basically like saying we can only focus on the negatives in the conversation. And so therefore, we should not even consider the positive things that they themselves say they get out of social media.
You had another, I'm going to jump ahead to myth 8 because I feel like it connects well here. Myth 8 was teens using their smartphones around each other is a sign of a disconnected and discontented generation.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought, oh, that's nice because I have so often seen open the door to talk to my kids and they have a friend over and they're on the bed or couch or whatever. and they're both on their phones, or there could be like 3 of them on their phones, or all of them are playing a game together on the iPad or whatever device I have. And I had this sense of guilt, like they should be making a puzzle. No, I mean, I love puzzles, but I'm part of a different generation, so
I think what's tricky about this is that we presume to know what people are doing with their mobile devices when they're using it. And when we watch other people, we assume the worst, right? So maybe I'm sitting there in the doctor's office composing a very sincere note to my mom because I'm worried about my health. So, oh no, I'm disconnected with the people in the doctor's office, but I'm talking to my mom because I'm scared, right? Maybe teens together are actually playing, a game that requires interactivity. So they're all playing the same game together, and they're kicking each other and they're elbowing each other and they're laughing together and they're saying, "Damn it, you got me," when they played some game together. And they're all doing it in their co-present experience, but they're also using their devices to do that. I'd also call a question, is it the case that you are, snuggled up with your loved one watching a movie together? Is that all that different? Right? You're engaged in media, you're not talking to each other, but you're physically touching each other and you're in co-presence. So there's a lot of complexities when it comes to whether or not that this is actually, detracting or taking away from the positivity of people's connection. What I will say though is, and I was very clear in my response, it does seem to be the case that co-present mobile device use is harmful when you're making first impressions with people that you don't know and you are not listening to them or not attending to them. Those effects seem to be strong, consistent, and experimental. So if you're basically ignoring someone who you could be talking to by looking into your device, there I think is very strong social scientific evidence that that's not particularly good for impression formation, quality communication, or other things. However, interestingly, when you have people who are more developed in relationships, there are two kind of bodies of literature. One that says, if I'm hanging out with a friend right before class starts and we're both on our device, people don't even attend to those things as being a problem. They recognize that that's just what you do. They may be looking at each other's phones. They may be saying, "Hey, what's our class assignment today?" and scrolling through their assignments on their device, right? But they don't, it's so pervasive yet also so unimportant that they don't even remember that they did it when observers in a study came up to them afterwards and said, "Did you know that you were on your device?" And they're like, "What are you talking about? I wasn't on my device. I was talking to my friend," right? So it's just they don't pay attention. So that's one body of literature. But the other body of literature I think is worth attending to is people in romantic relationships who are chronically ignoring their partner because they're paying attention to their device does tend to be associated with negative outcomes in a relationship. So if you are a person who is chronically and pervasively ignoring your partner, not probably a great use of your mobile device. So I do think that there's reason to say we should have limits and choices about when we use it and be responsive to the normative constraints of our own relationships, particularly in cases when we're meeting somebody for the first time or making a good first impression.
yeah, there's a lot of really great points there. And I would maybe like to chip in and say chances are that if the relationship if there isn't a lot of talking or connection in the relationship, whoever is on the device will just find another outlet, right? And I think that sort of resonates in some of the other work that you've produced. The other thing that I picked up in the article, which I believe was from here, is that there's no evidence that teens or the younger generation lack communication skills because they're on their devices. I would even go so far as to predict that they have a more evolved communication pattern than like if I was to try it, I can't even keep up with half the words sometimes. And, it's silly. It doesn't take long for someone in their 30s to feel outdated from someone in their 20s and 40s to 30s. So I think it will resonate up through the generations even more so. Did you come across any work that would support or substantiate that impression?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was a really excellent and very, very recent longitudinal study done on Norwegian children that looked at adolescents specifically. So this is really focused on the question of, does it hurt sort of teen development? And it found that that is not the case, that if that kids were using social media earlier in their life, that they had less time with their friends in the future, or that they actually had less social skills in the future. That didn't happen. Instead, they found the opposite, which is very social teens tended to be also social in the future. This actually really revolves around earlier literature on Facebook and earlier forms of social media which were popular, which was that social people use lots of ways to be social. So one thing to keep in mind about this is that it's kind of more of a both and than an either or. So people tend to think of, I'm either talking online or I'm talking offline, right? But it tends to be much more the case that you're talking online and you're talking offline. And if you're very, very lonely and isolated, you're also doing neither. So I think what's important here is to think of it as a trade-off really sort of misses how people use communication in their daily lives to keep in touch with one another and also to be entertained and to be connected. So one thing I might add to this, I think is an important way, though, to make a bit of a caveat, is that it may not be consistent with your own goals or desires. Like if you're like, I don't want to be spending as much time in front of a television set, a video game console, or my device, and I would prefer to spend time with friends, I'm a big proponent of that. Like if that is consistent with your goals, is important for you, I say that there's great research evidence that says that you choosing to spend more time with people face to face or having more meaningful conversations improves your well-being a lot more than spending time on social media.
Yeah, and I can't wait to dive into that because I know that your book is really, it goes into that even more. But there was one other claim or myth in the paper, and maybe we can just talk about it generally. And that was that, like being on social media enhances the possibility that someone will become depressed, or that in itself will produce loneliness. And I think you have a few myths that sort of revolve around that concept.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So this one was really specific to a timing question. One of the major debates that are brought up by Twenge and Jonathan Haidt are around the timing. And they are making an argument and have been making this argument since 2012 that the timing is, in their own words, like uncanny or provides absolute unequivocal proof that when it came to pass that smartphones and sort of interactive social media like Instagram came to pass as being the major dominant
Yeah, when they were launched. Yeah.
Right. That led to this plummeting rates of everything, right? So increased suicide ideation or depression, anxiety. I mean, Anxious Generation is the book, of course, or, decreasing rates of connection or increasing rates of loneliness. And what we see here is that there is just the first thing is that their argument, if you listen to what they say, if you listen to the book, the timing shifts and changes all the time, right? What is the year that it started? It kind of shifts, right? Which is the outcome they're talking about that shifts. They're not being particularly consistent in what they're saying exactly is the sort of if-then relationship. The other thing we have to keep in mind here is we're talking about also something that is such a important effect size argument, meaning if we expect there to be a dramatic change, we also would have to have dramatic effects, right? So I'll give you an analogy to think about. In the United States, as we've had the fentanyl crisis, the rates of people taking fentanyl and dying from fentanyl have been atrocious. We are looking at, I think, nearly a million Americans now that have died of overdose of fentanyl in the United States. The effect of fentanyl is so terrible that to say fentanyl has led to these deaths or premature deaths, there's just no question. The effect size meets the outcome, right? But to say that the effect size of social media is so big to explain the outcomes associated with teen mental health, they're just not there. It would have to have like a fentanyl size effect on people's well-being in order to make these changes that they're claiming it makes.
I think it's a really good analogy because the weight of the claim is like on the same par as the case that you just brought up, like the effects of taking medications, like things that were made for to medicate. They're so massive, and yet you and I both know that we'll go on our phone, and I'm pretty sure I don't feel like I just took a dose of fentanyl. So it's like the immediate effect of the exposure is very mild. And of course, some researchers and academics and any person really could argue that long-term exposure, like a cumulative exposure, could then produce these effects. And is that what they're getting at? Like it's a small dose every day that you don't notice, and therefore with time it accumulates, like sitting in the chair, like sitting is the new smoking.
Well, it depends. So what's challenging about this, and I don't want to take two researchers and say that they are fully responsible for all the claims that have come out about this, although they are major proponents of this argument. there are lots of people who are pontificating and speculating and saying stuff and writing op-eds. I mean, senators, even President Biden did a couple of years ago in the Wall Street Journal. The point is that these claims are all over the place. So sometimes researchers who are very responsible, who are indeed saying this is the new tobacco, that we should be treating this as tobacco and tobacco effects. And again, I would point out the research on tobacco and its effect on cancer otherwise, from lab mice studies to long-term studies to packs a day studies to looking at everything from
the dose response.
It's just powerful, undeniable evidence of the links between these things and cancer, right? So to say then that there is evidence that social media has powerful, undenying evidence of causing anxiety or depression doesn't make any sense. So even if we take it down a huge notch from fentanyl, the other thing that I'd say here to keep in mind, and I think this is an important kind of caveat to think about, is that when we are unpacking how to understand these phenomenon, you are right. There is an argument potentially around a dosage effect. And this one is a super tricky argument, because what it would say is you would have to know how much media over time wouldn't change an outcome year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, but would change an outcome year 20, 30, or whatever, right? Well, social media has not been around for 20, 30 years, so we can't do that. And when we do have longitudinal data, and we have outstanding studies that have been done in the Netherlands, some studies that are 10 years in length in the United States, but not very many, some that are actually out of the UK, some are actually, so there are scattered studies throughout the world that are longitudinal in nature over long periods of time. They do not find a dosage effect. They do not find there being clear evidence that there's a cumulative effect. So the few that do exist and study things as various as screen time metrics to social media specifically, they're just not finding that. So what's hard is that if again, I think what Jonathan Haidt has said specifically on occasion in a podcast that I watch with him, he's basically, this is a ticking time bomb, and I'd rather be a person who is the boy who cried wolf than to not say anything because it's going to happen. Well, I'm just going to say, as a researcher with humility, could be. You could totally be right that it could be the case that if we just wait long enough, we'll look back and say, oh my God, what mistakes we made and how much
we were so blind. Yeah.
Right. We may. But I also think that there's just not a whole lot of clear evidence from media research that goes all the way back to studying things like television, studying things like radio programs or video games that suggest that this is a ticking time bomb that hurts people over time. Certainly not to the degree to which these arguments are being made.
I think you also brought up in some of the the counter arguments was the idea that if people are suffering from depression or they're going through some hardships, it could be that they just choose the phone to go to. It's like they could have chosen something else, but the phone is there and it's the easiest one, so that's what they choose. It's not that the phone is causing the depression. It's actually on contrary, that it's an easy outlet for us to, become distracted, or there's probably a lot of other reasons why you might go to it to uplift. On the positive side, you may go to the phone to try and reconnect. In other ways, you can use it as a source of information. So there's lots of reason why someone who isn't feeling at their best may actually seek out the phone or the mobile device to do that.
You're exactly right. And I think we want to think about these at 2 time scales. One is a population level, long-term time scale. One of them is a momentary one. So let's start with the big one. You are correct. I think one of the strongest arguments, at least the ones that I'm compelled by, is that this is a case of reverse causality. That the small negative associations between things like depression and loneliness and social media use are most likely the case that people who are very depressed or who are very lonely are turning to social media use. The reason that I think that this is quite plausible is that if we look at the research on television and we say who has 12 hours a day to spend in front of a TV, it's people very lonely. It's people who don't have a job and they don't have meaningful alternatives in life. Sometimes these folks also suffer from home lives that are dangerous or uncomfortable. They lack friends, or maybe they lack mobility, right? They're stuck in their home. They are impaired in some fashion and just cannot get out of their house safely, economically, or have no reason to get out of their house because they don't have a job or they don't have other, meaningful activities that they're engaging in. Is that the case that all of those things are associated with loneliness? Absolutely. In fact, some of the largest studies that have looked at what is associated with depression and loneliness, those are the things, right? feeling disconnected, meaningless, that you have really very little to do with your lives and ample time. Would people in those times turn to media? There's unequivocal evidence that they do, right? We know that people who are single, lonely adults tend to turn on the television set when they wake up, and they leave it on all day long. Now that they're more likely to do that with their mobile device, they carry it around in their days. People also use a television podcast like the one we're on right now, listening to music, watching television, and also watching movies to fill up the space of feeling disconnected, like they're feeling a little isolated. So the voices of other people, the experiences of other people make us feel loved and connected in the world. Those aren't necessarily bad things. So if we think both in the big picture of who are the people who are most likely to have time, motivation, and reason to be seeking out media of any sort, including social media, it makes sense that it might be people who are feeling disconnected and lonely. At a momentary level, I think we need to think about this in a different way. It's actually not necessarily a bad thing to turn to your mobile device when you're feeling disconnected. The research that I do, and the research that perhaps I'm most conversant in, would say that texting a friend when you're feeling lonely or feeling disconnected, texting your mom, checking with people that you care about, seeing pictures of new friends' babies or their pets or their dogs, those things are actually not a bad thing. Those are good, healthy coping mechanisms to resolve feelings of momentary feelings of disconnection or low affect or negative affect. They are not only good, but in as much that they're more interactive, meaning I'm sending a message to someone else to express my affection or care for them, that's actually good for them too, right? So these are good things that people can be doing with their mobile devices.
Yeah, it's a compounding effect when you engage. And you had a really interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal about interactions and the energy that is required even to like send that message. So one thing is that someone may feel not at their best. They're experiencing a low moment in their life, and then they'll turn to the phone and seek that as a source of connection. And then there's the other side of the story, which I know that you have evolved in your research, which is focusing on like, why do people do it and why don't they actually reach out to connect? Yeah. And I think that is so interesting. But before we move on to that, because that is actually my next topic, you had in your paper that you quoted some other researchers about a metaphor and this donut metaphor. And I thought, oh my God, this is so fun. It was so great. I shared it with my family. So I mean, I have it here, but you probably remember it. So it was like this idea that you should look and view your phone more like a donut rather than a drug or a demon. And maybe you can explain why we should view our phone like a donut.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to give a shout out to my friend Marique. Marique came up with this.
So great.
Yeah, Marique. and I always I want to get her name right. It's Abele, I think.
Yeah,
so that's how I think I'm
Abele.
pronouncing
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
She is a friend now, and I actually reached out to her years ago when she wrote a paper that I loved, and I was like, "This is a great paper." And then she wrote this paper, and I wrote to her then, and this is before we had met face to face. And since we've collaborated and talked quite a bit about these issues, she is her idea, so I want to give her full credit for it. And I quote her specifically in the paper, so I don't claim this is mine. She says that we have kind of three metaphors. And I think that that's such a useful thing. When we're talking about science, when we're thinking about public education, we have to speak in metaphors because it's a very useful way for the public to understand it. The drug metaphor essentially is the one we've already talked about. It's like fentanyl. It's like tobacco. And the drug metaphor basically says it is absolutely addictive. There is nothing you can do to resist it. It has the same sort of addictive properties in the sense of hits and tolerance and all of that withdrawal. The second one is demon. This one is this idea that platforms, Meta, Alphabet, these companies are insidiously designing these things to trap you, track you, and basically kind of control your life. And what's, probably the metaphor with that one that's the most useful was a very bad, I would think it was meant to be a documentary, but I really don't know. A very bad one created recently by the Center for Humane Technology, which was called, that was on this topic, basically portrayed social media companies as little puppet masters, forcing people to do these things.
Another conspiracy theory.
It's very conspiratorial, but it also taps into, I think, fears about science, fears about kind of technology that have always been there, mind control, our lack of ability to control it.
Birds are not real. Yes, all of
Yeah,
that.
right. I mean, that there is something insidious out there, right?
Mm.
But the third metaphor that Marie argues for is the donut. And the donut metaphor is basically saying that in the big picture, eating a donut is irrelevant. One donut on any given day does very, very little to you. And even having donuts as part of all the things you eat are not going to ruin probably your health and nutrition. Small effect, right? Something that's immediately pleasurable, but part of a broader media and social behavior diet. And what I love about thinking that as a diet is that I very much believe that social behavior and media behavior fit kind of what we might call broadly leisure. How do we spend our free time? How does it fit into largely what we do? And interestingly, we can also think about this metaphor in terms of the current conversation and controversy around what would be called hyperpalatable foods. So again, this one's fascinating because in some sense, hyperpalatable foods, they've recently researchers like not great for you, right? Definitely not great for you in the bigger picture. But are there some that are good for you? Yeah, like yogurt's really good for you, and actually, which is hyperpalatable food. So is actually eating bread that doesn't go bad right away because that it's good for you to eat, and peanut butter is good for you to eat. But these are also
butter.
very but they're foods that have been processed.
And donuts. I do.
Yeah, right? So the thing is, but they're part of a broader thing, and they're just not going to change your life that much. They're just part of kind of where it's at. But the other thing that I bring up with this donut metaphor is if you turn to donuts to cope, you've created a new problem. If you have used donuts to actually try to avoid real problems, you are probably making things worse, right? You're creating a new habit that is actually substituting in for existing issues that you're really struggling with. And that's why I love about this metaphor is that, the habit of excessive donut eating in response to real problems will create new problems. But that does not mean that donuts caused your unhappiness. It means there are poor coping mechanisms that are suitable to your life. And that is one take-home message I feel strongly about this paper. I am not saying that social media is a good coping mechanism. I am saying that social media does not cause all of the harms that people are suggesting that it does.
Why do you think that media has run headlines that would imply this? Like we had the demon headline, like, what was it? Apple developers don't let their kids use smartphones. And maybe that's true to a certain extent. I remember one person, divulged this, and then you have so many others. Why do you, clear and simple, why is media running headlines like this?
Well, first thing I'll mention that specific case because I've talked to other folks about this before. We are talking about billionaire class folks, and billionaire type lifestyles allow for billionaire type education. And if I could afford in my life to have a private tutor for my two wonderful kids to follow their passions and interests and have that passions both developed on the devices that they use and the computers they learn to do things like graphics and video editing and music and sharing ideas, and which is all the things they like to do, but guided by a private tutor because I was a billionaire who could afford their days to be filled with enrichment. Would I say I'm forbidding them to be on social media even if I work for a social media company? Yeah, I probably would. Not because I think social media is necessarily toxic, bad, insidious demon, but because I'm cultivating a perfect life for them. And the perfectionism that comes along with that would mean I would restrict anything that I would consider low quality media, right?
Or low quality time.
Or low quality time. Very well said. But what's odd is that you notice that even in a perfect version of those things, does that stop those same people from turning to media of various sorts to be educated or to learn or develop their thinking? No. They might watch film or documentary, and they're like, well, that's good media, right? Or they might do things like, create graphic designs or learn how to plot statistics, or maybe they're learning how to, research things or look for high quality research sites on the internet. Those are good things. What's happening is that those claims, I think we are always sifting between what we think are virtuous forms of media use and what are bad forms of media use. And this debate goes back years and years and years of time, 80, 90 years of media history research, where people have always said high culture, low culture debates are central to this. There's stuff for the masses, which is garbage, and then there's stuff for the elite. And this is still happening right now. So why do I think in part are these misinformed headlines and otherwise dominating the effects? Why are the conversations focusing on what the most rich, the most elite of us are doing? It's because it's always been that way. We imagine our lives are better and more pure when we watch what the rich are doing and simulate what they do. But I think the other part about it is that it's simply a derogation of the way that people use their time. We want to look down on it and say that that those folks are worse than me, right? But I would say that, if you look at the number one way that people the number one, number two genres of books are romance novels and cookbooks. Like, and who am I to judge if you're reading that you love to learn about food and romance? Like, there's also no real evidence that you spending your time reading those things makes you a worser person. It might not be my cup of tea, but it doesn't make you worse as a person for having done it. The number one forms of streaming media content are things like reality television shows and dating games, right? Where people like picking their fiance based on, not even knowing what they look like or whatever. The point that I'm making here is that there is a popular culture versus elite culture or some sort of high culture argument has always been with us. That social media is like a siphon that sucks up tons and tons of popular culture is merely reflecting what people want back to them, right? They were already consuming those things, and that they're consuming those things on social media makes sense because it's just a new form of consuming the same stuff. But I am working very, very hard as an individual to say, I do not want to engage in a condemning or pointing my finger or school marming somebody to say, because you like romance stuff or because you like real serial drama TV or podcasts or whatever, you're a lesser form of reader because I seek out good literature and music because I'm better. Like, to me, that's just kind of, I think, that's a cultural elitism that I'm working very hard to push back against because I think it's so tempting to explain what's going on.
Yeah, I think that would make such a great topic of discussion generally. I think there's a lot of very, very intelligent people that probably don't want to admit that they like to maybe sit down and watch romance movies, or they get hooked on a cooking show, or, some of the reality TV shows, people may watch them because they want to see the behavior of others, maybe people that they think are their reflections of themselves. And then there are other people that just, really appreciate the art form of a good story. So they may go into something else. So yeah, I think you're right. I think, we shouldn't be quick to judge at what people like to spend their time on, especially their free time, because it could be whatever, it's what they need. It's what, as you said earlier, it's what brings them joy. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, that they're lesser in any way. It could be quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah. I think that having a generosity of spirit towards others is actually a kind of a guiding light for me. And I work very hard in the way that I talk about these things to continue to show that generosity of spirit, because I just don't think it's in my interest as a person who's trying to engage the public in complicated conversations to pretend I'm a know-it-all or I know better than everyone about these things. So, I would only kind of end with, I think, something that I think is a really, I think a meaningful observation, which is that when we really begin to unpack how people use their free time, a researcher once said to me, people are under no obligation to perfect their free time so as to achieve maximal well-being. It is not fair for researchers who study well-being like I do to say, y'all should be pursuing maximum happiness or maximum life satisfaction. Instead, I see it this way. If it's consistent with your goals to do X, Y, or Z, and that may be decreasing your time on social media or increasing the time you're reading books, or maybe the opposite. It's more time on social media and less on books because it's just your choice. Then it's my job as a researcher to help you think through how to accomplish the goals that are meaningful to you and getting you closer to the things that you want to achieve in your life. But I'm working very hard not to judge those goals.
Yeah, I think actually it might make a lot of people feel quite relieved, including parents, to know that, when they do spend time on social media, they're not putting themselves at risk for developing depression. And I think those types of headlines are really, really potentially damaging. And I guess I'm sure you've had the same thought, where if people continue to run headlines like this, then the real problems don't get addressed, like the root problems.
You are bringing up another thing. One of a researcher who I admire quite a bit, she made the argument that it's possible that a lot of people are doing this cynically. They're blaming social media to ignore things like lack of access to healthcare or mental health care or poverty or poor or child abuse. They're basically saying, as long as we keep on this whole social media thing, we can not only sue the companies, but we can also successfully not be responsible for the real causes of the worst outcomes that kids are facing in the United States. Poor schooling, a lot of schools, they don't even have free lunches, right? They're not able to eat, and they don't have safe places to go to school. And they're like, it's all social media's fault. And that makes me want to throw up my hands and feel like, I don't know, despair. So there is an argument to be made that this is a cynical ploy done by people who are responsible for changing our lives, such as legislatures and otherwise. But I think I don't buy that 100%. And the reason is I don't is that I think you're also correct that there's a strong, strong desire by the public to have answers. I'm a parent of 2 kids who are 14 and 11. I want to know. I talk to parents who have similar age kids. They want to know. We want to know the answers. We want to know what we can do to help our kids. And I think as researchers, it's our responsibility to have highly informed, high quality conversations, which is why I wrote the paper, is I want people to have high quality information so they can make their own decisions about what's important for their families. And I think that that's my goal broadly about educating the public.
Yeah, I found it actually really enlightening overall, just in my personal well-being. When I think about how my kids are utilizing their phones and mobiles and how they interact with their friends, I actually feel lighter because I've been able to say, okay, this is not as bad as media has actually convinced me. And I am myself a researcher, but I've actually never read the studies. Like I've just been bombarded by my headlines. I can be just as susceptible as anyone else when it's something outside of my field. So I really do appreciate that you wrote the study. I think it's fantastic. I wanted to talk to you about free time and interactions because this work also very nicely opens up to how we're spending our time. So you talked about how we shouldn't judge people on how they use their free time and they shouldn't use it maximally. And I'm always trying to get the most out of my free time. Probably I have some buried issues. So I, just can't relax and watch a romance show or whatever, which anyways. But like you write in one of the Wall Street articles that people are exhausting. And those words are like they're paired together. There's all 3 of them. People are exhausting. You wrote that. And I happen to know a lot of people that would agree. And and it's also as for me though with personal anecdotes. But I'm quite interested in how you managed to arrive at that conclusion as a researcher.
That is such a wonderfully loaded setup. I enjoyed that path getting here so much. One last thing I'd add about the social media thing, which I think is fun, is there was a researcher done actually out of Marique's lab and found that when people engage in mindless scrolling, they do after the fact go, that wasn't a very good use of my time. You know what's funny is if they felt guilty for it, it takes away from any pleasure they got from it. So it's not just the scrolling, it's the guilt that makes people not enjoy it. So I think that that's really something that researchers of media and leisure have not quite lined up yet, which is this idea is there are all of these things that you could find enjoyable and pleasurable, but how you judge yourself doing those things plays a role in whether it gives you well-being. So thinking through that process of why do I judge myself or what do I think is perfect or whatever, I think is really important in this. But I will say to your question about people that are exhausting. So this is to give you some context. I have been working on a theory called communicate, bond, belong theory for almost 10 years now. So the idea is you talk, you bond, and then you sense of belonging in your life, right? And this theory is different than other theories that are about the need to belong or a sense of belonging or other ones that are associated with this process of feeling connected. Not because that I disagree with those, because I agree with the fundamental idea that we are built to be social and that we have a healthier, happier life when we live a social life. And I believe those things because I think the empirical evidence is unequivocal, and I think that's really, really good. And I think the study quality is really good. And I think the longitudinal data is really good. Having a social and connected life is a good life. And I am a strong advocate for doing what we can as a society and improving the discourse around those things so that people are suffering from loneliness or disconnection can find connection in their lives. But the communicate, bond, belong theory is different because it also says that people are exhausting. And if you, that it says that essentially we have a limited amount of social energy to offer others, and that is not it is a renewable resource because we sleep, we eat, we get our energy back, we rest, we have solitude, and then we can do it again. But that essentially it's a trade-off. So that if I have a job, which I do, on days that I teach, it is a intensely social activity, right? It's not like I'm running a marathon in the sense that I'm not using my body physically that much, although I'm gesticulating, I'm projecting, I'm walking, right? But the social part of it is huge. I think about what I'm going to do before I teach. An hour and 20 minutes into class is really socially intense because I'm watching every word I say. I'm thinking carefully about dynamics. I'm watching the classroom. I'm getting energy from my people in my classroom,
Or
my students.
giving it.
I'm giving it and I'm getting it, right? Because I'm
Yeah.
seeing their negative feedback, like, I don't understand what Dr. Hall's talking about, or they're bored, or they don't care, or they're excited and they're interesting and they're engaged. And both of those things require energy from me to say, okay, which way to go and how do we manage this? After I teach, I feel tired. After I teach, I often close my office door and I seek solitude to basically regain my energy back. But also at the end of my days, on teaching days, I'm more tired at the end of the day and I have less to give to my family. And I would guess that a lot of folks out there have jobs where are highly social. And when they go home, they just do not have the energy that they would like to have for their kids or for their partner. They don't have time to go out with friends because they've had to work late, or they've had to actually have such a socially exhausting job. They don't have it to give. One thing I'm very, very concerned about is I believe that we have a culture in which that we have decided collectively in the United States that our goals are really around maximization of our output and our success for the sake of oftentimes moving up the career ladder for people who I think are of higher social class, but also for the sake of just keeping your job and being able to make enough money for people who are working 2 or 3 jobs or have uncertain forms of income. The combination of these things means that the expectation of providing for yourself and your family financially is often offsetting our time to be with one another. In fact, the American Time Use Survey finds that the strongest negative correlation between social time is time at work. So the more time you're working, the less time you're being social. And this makes sense. Part of it is because we don't have the energy, and part of it is we don't have the time. And if you combine the both because you work long hours and you're exhausted, you just don't have much to give to anybody. Which goes back to the question of why are people exhausting? People are exhausting because I think that what essentially the theory that I work from argues is that in the process of feeling arousal, focus, concern, empathy, support, all of the wonderful things that we provide another person, we listen to them and care for them, whether we're joking around and having an enlivening conversation, talking about something deep and meaningful, giving them a shoulder to cry on. The affect component of this is a component of it, but it's not the whole story, right? We are giving our energy and requiring energy of us to connect. And that is a great thing. But the problem is with that is that it's exhausting to be around people. I was invited to go to a party recently with my wife for people who I didn't meet. And she goes, oh, we're going to see this couple. I'm like, that's fine. And the professor's at KU. And I'm like, that's fine. I have something to talk about. And, I haven't also been around a lot of people because we've been on snowed in here in Kansas for a while. But then she's like, oh, and there's also going to be other couple people there. I'm like, wait, okay, how many people are here? How big is this? How many different people I'm trying to learn from? And my feeling of, oh my gosh, that's starting to be a lot to be asked of me, to meet new people, to make a new, to put on a good face, to be able to maintain conversation, started feeling more anxiety producing. And it was actually socially quite taxing to go there to try to manage those dynamics because these folks all knew each other and I was new to it all. So the combination of all these things means that the very gifts we give other people in our social presence require energy of us. And because of that, people oftentimes will say, I don't have it to give. I'm going to make excuses. I'm not going to go out. I'm not going to prioritize it. I'm not going to talk to somebody. I'm going to send a text over a phone call. So we do all of these things to try to protect ourselves from the energy costs of being around people, although the research is unequivocally clear that giving energy to other people through conversation, attention, support, care, concern, fun, laughter, that's actually really, really good for us. And we should be doing it. But we're like, ugh, people.
Yes. But one could say that it's parallel to exercise. Like, you wouldn't be upset if you were exhausted after exercising, right? That would be a good thing. And what you have just basically laid out is that, well, you get what you give, right? So if you give that energy into interacting with people, then at least in the book, part of the book that you let me read, you get it back, right? So it is the same thing with your exercise. You won't get the gains right away. Those gains will they'll compound with time. The more you give, the more you'll get back. And with time, when you think about the new relationships, which is what I've also learned from your book, is that they become less energy intensive. So the more familiar you become with someone, the less energy they required. And I just want to thank you for highlighting that, because when I read it, I went, oh, that sounds very true. Like, you didn't need to lay out the data. It just resonated with my personal self. That I was like, yeah, I could definitely see, like, when you start a new friendship or a new colleague, it does take more energy. And then with time, it's like, some people may identify it as like you let your guard down, so you feel more relaxed. I don't know. There's probably some sort of like parallels between those stories. Yeah. So it's not that I think that it's a bad observation, not at all. I think it's actually refreshing to know that other people also feel that people are exhausting, but that it's also like exercise in the sense that you do need to be exhausted once in a while, because it will give you benefits down the line. In the articles and then also in your book, I'm sure you probably highlight, like, what is it that really makes the interaction so exhausting? Like, you mentioned that a lot of emotions are going, and our attention level is set to max. Are there other things that?
So, you mentioned a lot of things there that I think are important for us to think about. I accept the metaphor of it, thinking about it in terms of exercise. I think that that's a good way to think about it. I also think that there's good reason to believe that the more we practice at it, the easier it gets. There is really good reason to believe that when people are very practiced at a social interaction, it's not so bad. So if you want to think about the first time you did a job interview, it was absolutely exhausting. But your 10th job interview, you're like, yeah, this is not so bad. Right? This happens with people who are in sales. This happens with people who are having difficult conversations with their partner. This happens when they're teaching, right? Public speaking. Basically, social interactions can be trained to reduce the amount of energy by being familiar. So one major factor is familiarity. The more familiar we are with any type of social interaction, the less energy it requires of us. So we found this both in high intensity social interactions, and we found this in day-to-day interactions in the study that we did on social energy. The second one is actually how difficult or intense the conversation. And difficult and intense are slightly different concepts here. Difficult means it requires like cognitive complexity around things like, how do you see me and how do I see you? So I've been teaching nonverbal communication for, 20 years now. I have studied impression formation and management. And what we know is difficult impression formation and management issues are very taxing on people. People feel like they're being judged or not sure how people regard them. They feel anxious about that, and they get worried about their self-presentation. All of those are high energy states. What you mentioned about your friend is a great example of the opposite, right? This is when we feel as if no time has passed. We just kind of are at ease with ourselves, right? And there are two probably reasons that we feel this way. One has to do is we know we're judged positively and affectionately, which means our arousal system is relaxed, and our sense in which that we can feel comforted and nourished and a sense of belonging is happening in that very moment we are with our friends. The other reason is that we actually don't have to engage in all of that complicated, difficult thing like self-presentation or difficulty or whatever, because being around a friend means we just get to talk about whatever. We get to know what they're talking about. We know that they like us. We can make jokes that are maybe off color or inside jokes because we know our friend's going to be supportive. So what's neat is that the familiarity also creates belongingness and it reduces our energy costs. So when you invest in relationships at the beginning, high energy, high energy, high energy, and over time it declines to a place in which that we get it and we get to enjoy the great stuff about belonging without the energy intensiveness. Which goes to the other part though, which is the intensity of the conversation. So we can have intense conversations with friends. In fact, maybe some friendships that we have are all intense conversations. And some friends we have never have intense conversations. We can have intense conversations at work, but we can also have boring, mundane meeting conversations where we talk about nothing. The deal here is that intensity means this feeling that I have to focus, give attention to it, that it's has a high emotional valence, which can be both positive and negative. I'm very, very excited, or I'm very, very nervous. And then the last factor that really sort of affects whether we put energy is time. So a 3-hour meeting, totally exhausting compared to a 1-hour meeting. And when we did our study to say what were the most memorable, high intensity, social, taxing things that people did, they pointed to things like weddings, family reunions, parties, things that were really took a very long time, were very, very social, as being very taxing on people. The other examples they gave were days where they had to do sales pitches, like they had to go one place to the next to try to sell something, or they had job interviews lined up one after the next. And what these kind of told us was that the length of time, independently of intensity, difficulty, and familiarity, also contributed to people's fatigue socially.
I mean, that makes sense. The last one, like that, yeah. I mean, it's just like a multiplication factor. Excuse me. X and Y, and then by how much time. So it definitely makes sense. I was thinking a lot about, because you mentioned earlier free time, and because we've already established people are exhausting, but we know that it's required. It brings us benefits. In your book, you highlight some data that talk about that what we do with our free time now is not spent on these interactions, but rather it's spent in time alone. And what is happening? What are you observing? Like, I'm guessing this is not necessarily, I don't know if it's a global issue or it might become a global issue. But it seems to be a trend that you're picking up in the US, and I would imagine in other parts of the world, in the global north. Yeah.
That's right. So the Wall Street Journal article on this, I called it the age of interiority. And I had data from the UK, from Australia, and the United States. And I wish I had data from other places, but time use data is actually really specific in how you get it. It's expensive to collect. So countries throughout the world don't all have access to it. You are also correct that loneliness is on the rise throughout the global north, particularly in countries that are highly individualistic, and also countries who are very economically developed, which is interesting. So you combine individualism, economic pressure to keep performing and working, and also ones that tend to be more associated with leisure time being spent in isolation or otherwise, all of which are contributing to loneliness.
So you highlight in your data that we actually have more free time now than we used to, but yet we're still spending more time alone. So I think it's just important to just make sure that comes out super clear. So we are having more free time because of technology, because of convenience, which you elegantly put together, like food can come to the doorstep. I don't need to go out and buy a new shirt. I can just have it delivered. So yes, tech is making this less interactions, even the small ones. Like you don't strike up a conversation in line anymore. Canadians, I'm Canadian. We do that all the time. So yeah, we don't, but you don't do it because you're you're at home. So we have more free time. And now you mentioned loneliness, that's on the rise. So now we have a bunch of things. There's a bunch of balls in the air right now. So I would like to talk about where are we spending our time now that we have more of it? And then I would very much like you to explain why you think that is contributing to loneliness.
Well, and you are correct. Leisure time is up. time with other people is down. And where's that time going? It's going actually largely to the television set. So one of the most powerful explorations of time use data from 1965 in the United States to the present says that the largest way in which that our free time is being absorbed is through media of various types. Television from most of that time, from 65 to the present. But in the case of more recent time, that's turning to the device, which is basically the mobile device is a form of consuming television-like content in ways that are different in terms of its form, but many times identical in terms of content.
Right.
That makes
So it's
sense.
not, it's because I think it's important to draw, like, circle back to the 10 myths that we just covered. So it's not the device here. It's about what you're choosing to spend your time on. And it's watching content.
That's correct. So there's a couple ways I think in the book we try to talk about this. The book is called the Social Biome with my colleague Andy Merolla, and in the book, what we try to talk about and really balance here is that yes, it is both the case that loneliness is going up, social time is going down, right? And it is the case that media is occupying the time. That's where did that time go? But the thing we try to address in the book is that this is not a causal relationship. This is a structural issue. And let me give you a couple examples I think are really interesting. The rates of people who are living alone in the United States and throughout the world have grown, in Western world specifically, but even places like Japan and otherwise. The rates of living alone have gone higher than they have ever before. We're looking at the case in which that they're like 3 times as much as they were in the 80s. So if you live alone, structurally speaking, your opportunities for social connection are lower, right? There's a research study that was just done actually from researchers in Berlin, and what they found was that when you live with other people, you're having incidental contact unintentionally all of the time. It's unavoidable. There's also an argument to be made that co-presence, while not interacting, is also very valuable. So even if we're watching a TV show together, we're together. Even if we're reading a book on the couch together, we can touch each other. So it's important to keep in mind that nearly the feeling that there's other people present in our homes may also ameliorate loneliness. The second structural thing I think we want to think about is family size and marriage rates. There's really good evidence that says that people with siblings are less lonely as they grow up. There's evidence that says that people with cousins and otherwise are less lonely when they grow up. Those two things are both about family size shrinking. And the other one is rates of marriage. First-time marriage is higher in the United States and the Western world than it has been in recorded history. So now it's over 30 years old for men and almost approaching that for women in the US. And I'm not saying everybody should get married. I want to be clear on that. And I think there are alternative arrangements and households that should be celebrated. But what I am saying is people are putting it off for longer and longer periods of time because of economic precarity, because of debt, and feeling like they haven't figured themselves out. All of these factors means that a major force in reducing your loneliness or disconnection or time alone is being put aside for the future. This, and according to the data, is really, really powerfully hitting people who are of lower and middle class, lower class and middle class, particularly single men and particularly minoritized communities. So those minoritized communities in the United States are African American and Latino men, and also the case of people who are sexual minorities. The combination of these things means that where it is happening, that there are increasing loneliness, isolation, time with televisions, are also people who started out with less social resources and economic resources to begin with. So if you take the average married couple from 1965 to 2024, they look really similar in terms of social time. Still married, still very social, not particularly lonely, right? If you took the average single man from those two periods of time, huge difference in time alone, time in front of a television set and otherwise, which leads back to our 10 myths argument, right? When I was saying it's preconditioning structural issues and pre-existing issues that lead to social media or mobile media or gaming or TV, it's because of the structural characteristics of people's lives that are oftentimes precipitating these choices.
Yes, and I think do you think people are aware of the effects of loneliness? I enjoy my time alone. I don't believe that my time alone, I don't feel guilty, because you actually earlier in the podcast you said something about you have to remember, if you feel guilty after scrolling, then you're going to take away all the pleasure that you got from that scrolling, right? So you can choose not to feel guilty. So I don't I don't feel guilty about the time that I spend alone. I enjoy it. I also enjoy social interactions. But when do you believe that people are aware that when they are spending too much time alone, that could be just as debilitating long term as it would be as not getting nutrition, not exercising? Do you think it's a general understanding that people understand the effects of loneliness? I think maybe that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, I think your question is very well put. About 5-6 years ago, the Minister of Loneliness in the UK was appointed. Shortly thereafter,
There's a
one in
minister with that title?
briefly.
Oh.
I think it's been discontinued. But
He was
there was one.
disconnected. Yeah.
Well, I can't speak about UK politics about exactly how that came to pass, but I think it's been discontinued. So Australia have had studies around this. Canada has had studies around this. The United States Surgeon General released a huge report just 2 years ago while Andy and I were writing our book about loneliness. And the conversation has become much more aware. People are treating this as a public health issue. It's happening. So in the big picture, in the terms of social agencies and responsible state actors and academics, people are sounding the alarm and letting people understand. I think Andy and I's book, my work in the New York Times, my conversations broadly are trying to get people to be aware of these issues because I think that they are pressing issues. And I also believe that if I'm a person who thinks that I have something to offer that's research-based, that it can improve people's lives, I believe and I have strong evidence that being social, being compassionate and kind, and building your friendships are the way to get there. And I feel like I have really clear guidelines to suggest how to do that. So I'm passionate about it personally. I think governments are passionate about it and trying to get the message out there. But you're asking, I think, a slightly more nuanced question. What's very, very tricky is people I don't think are aware that the ways that they prioritize being alone may, in the long term, put them in a condition where they're going to be lonelier. The reason for that is that in the book, Andy and I point out, wanting to be around people and wanting to be alone are both human things. My theory that I work from says that we cycle in and out of loneliness and solitude in very healthy ways. In the study that Andy and I did that started the book, also where we coined the term the social biome, we actually found the strongest association with global well-being was actually how you felt when you were alone. If you felt connected and peaceable about being alone, you actually tended to have much higher well-being over time. And this was like experience samplings. We just say, hey, what are you doing? You're like, I'm alone. How do you feel about that? I feel great. I feel comfortable. That was indicative of how much well-being a person had. So I am a strong advocate of the idea that we cycle in and out of social interactions, that solitude is critical, that time to, rest, to kind of think, to be alone, to pursue our own interest, critical and healthy, and that there is very little benefit to keep pushing ourselves into being social beyond what would be called kind of an area of hormesis, which means growth through stress, right? So I am pro solitude. I'm big into that. However, your question, I think, is very, very savvy. Do people recognize how they are sliding into further and further states of disconnection because they prioritize solitude over all things? I do not think so. And the reason I don't think people are aware of it is that first, we have, in the age of interiority, I'm arguing we have a social discourse that says, be alone. It's great to be alone. Self-care, push away other people. People look for advice about how to cancel plans. People are calling about JOMO, which is the joy of missing out, right? I'm happy to not be invited. People are looking for ways to not be social and to forgive themselves for not being social. I think all of this stuff kind of suggests we are at an age and time where there is a strong public current of discourse that says being alone and forget other people is the right thing to do. Plus, we naturally inclined to want to do it, to be alone. Add that to the simplicity of ordering food, as you say, to getting media on demand from our devices, to anything that we need we can have provided for in our own homes. The combination of these things, I think, creates an age of interiority that becomes reflective in our people's own lives and on our discourse. What scares me about that is that as a researcher of friendship and relationships, you cannot have relationships without spending time with people. You cannot be friendly without having friends. Meaning, if you're not investing constantly in keeping in touch, caring for others, making time for other people, you will not have people in the future when you need them. What's very despairing about that for me is that totally rational human choices around preserving pleasure and autonomy in our age of interiority make total sense. They are also a very poor set of choices when it comes to building long-term well-being and happiness and the quality of our relationships for the future.
Would you say that people don't recognize that it's sort of like saving for the future and eating well today so that 20 years later, or brushing your teeth every day so that you have them when you're 85? Like, people don't see the benefit. They don't get the immediate reward. It's the same with working out. So they don't put the effort into nourishing those relationships. And actually, when I was reading part of your book, I was suddenly realizing, like, oh wow, like I'm being a bit lazy. Like, I'm not actually investing as much time as I should be in making the effort. And you said, like, even the small efforts matter, like reaching out on social media, writing a letter, sending a photo. Those things, they do require effort, but they also matter. And as someone that is living abroad, so I live in Denmark. I'm from Canada, so I have a lot of network in Canada still, and it has to be very planned. When do I meet them online because of the time difference? And it does require much more energy for me and them to coordinate that FaceTime. And so when I was reading this chapter, I was like, oh my God, this is me. Like, you're talking about me. And I'm not spending the time, and how is that going to affect me 10 years from now? And I don't think that people are really that they don't recognize it. And it is because we're being pushed to be very self-sufficient. And the other observation that I got from your book was that it knows no class. So, like, it doesn't matter like how much you earn, you're still doing it. You're just as susceptible as someone that earns half as much as you do. So we're on the same treadmill, which I thought to be quite ironic, because this idea of being rich and sitting in a yacht and having a party with your friends, that's a joke. Like, that's a lie. Nobody's doing that because they're still working. They might own the yacht, but they're not on it.
Yep. In the United States, actually, the top 5% of income earning households actually work the most hours. And in the US, that 5% would cut down to people who are doctors and lawyers and bankers that are all like working ridiculous numbers of hours. As an academic, I don't think I'm top 5% financially speaking, but I work 55-hour weeks routinely, right? And I'm in a place where my commute's really short. Close friend in Los Angeles commutes an hour and 15 minutes every day back and forth to their home and barely sees their kids. I know professionals who actually see their partners so little that it's hard to say that they are able to check in even every day to say hi or I care about you. We have built a culture in which that's striving to be the best, self-sufficient, as you said, successful. That's what we're trying to do. What's weird is I think that if I was to speculate, I think because it's broadly a feeling of precarity. What's really weird is even people who are making a lot of money feel precarious. They feel that if they're not continually striving, that they're at risk of getting their jobs cut, that they're at risk of losing out on some promotion or another form of money. And I would say that also in the age of AI, there is this new sort of looming threat that every one of our jobs is at risk, whether you're a professor or a podcaster or a banker. So I think what's weird is that we live in a world in which there are very, very good reasons that people are not paying attention to this. There are very rational reasons, financially speaking, that people are not prioritizing it. But I think that there's another piece to this, which I think we should be sensitive to. When I wrote the article in the Wall Street Journal about making friends at work, one of the things that I did was read the comments, which I know you're not supposed to do, but I read them because I'm curious. Like, what are people saying?
You're a researcher.
Of course I read them. They had a really good point. There were people who said, I don't go to work to make friends. They said, it's not always a great idea to be friends with work because, I'm in a competitive environment or I don't trust all these folks. They were right. But they also said, which I think is the key here, is they said, why do you even suggest I should be making friends at work? It's none of your damn business. In individualistic cultures, we very much believe that it's no other person's concern whether I have friends, spend my time social, or what I do with my personal life. It's mine. So I think that although the Surgeon General, these reports, everything is pushing awareness to say this is like exercise, y'all. This is like nutrition. We should be treating it like that. That there's a movement towards that. But there's a counter discourse that has existed since I was a child, at least, that says it's none of your damn business how I spend time with my relationships or I have friends. I don't care. I don't need them. And I think talking to other experts on this topic, there is not good evidence that people who said I have no need of relationships are accurate in their assessment. People are misconstruing pleasure and success for long-term happiness and growth. And in some sense, I know why, because we live in a world in which those things are prioritized. In another sense, it breaks my
And they're
heart.
glorified.
It's horrifying. And
Glorified. Yeah, they're also
yeah,
glorified.
well, it's horrifying to me because
It's
it's so
horrifying.
sad,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's glorified to be independent.
totally. Yep.
You know, young adults in the United States say that living alone is a success. So they're imagining a worldview where not being with other people is the best world to be in, right? What you said about moving across the world and having to keep in touch with friends throughout the world, that's very real. And that happens to Americans all the time as they move place to place. So what I'm saying is that people can't prioritize it because of the structural issues. There is a discourse that glorifies the isolation. And then there's also a counter discourse that says, screw you, how dare you tell me to be friendly or have friends?
Now, I'd like to talk about that counter discourse because I actually do think we have a right. And it goes back to what you said earlier, is that when I make an effort to be there and be supportive, be a friend, invest in my friendship, the other person also benefits from that. And then that is a compounding effect. Maybe they do it to somebody else. So you actually do have reason to push back on that because it is a society. If you want to benefit from the other things of society, whether that's driving down the roads that the government paid for, that lead you to the hospital, that is, well, in many countries, and I know in the US, I know not all healthcare is free, but you get my point, right? Like you want access to that hospital, like the fact that somebody else built it already so that you could go there. Those are part of your society that you partake in. So yes, I think that there is a reason why we should say, well, actually, it is our right to tell you these things. And yes, we do expect you to listen. Whether you follow them, okay, well, that's something else.
You know what? I take comfort as a person who cares about these things to quote someone who I really respect. So Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone. So written in 2000 or 99. And he documented the decline of social time together in the United States 25 years ago. He was, he went to the Clinton White House. He spoke to Barack Obama, major figure in the United States, thinking he was the head of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And also just a super nice, compassionate human being. And he was interviewed in the New York Times recently, and he said, the bottom line is we need to convince people that it's in their best interest to be socially obligated to each other. We have to do it. And he jokes, but don't ask me how. I've been trying to do it for 25 years and I'm not successful. So I take comfort in the idea I'm not going to be successful in this either. But what I have changed by thinking is we can think big scale, all right? Isolation, loneliness, society, democracy, roads, schools, And Putnam is concerned with those things. I'm concerned with those things, but that's not in my wheelhouse of research. I think small scale. And when I think small scale is, I'm not asking you to have a rich social life like your Don Draper from Mad Men and, schmoozing and, cavorting and, hosting parties all the time and have a wife and kids and a mistress on the side. I'm not asking, right? I'm saying once a month to go out with friends, once a month, once a week to check in with somebody you love and care about. Could be your sister, could be your mom, could be your kids, doesn't matter, right? And every day have a conversation with someone in your day that is meaningful to you or meaningful to them. That's it. If you want to add stuff that also makes your life better, you can do things like engage in small talk. And in our book, we talk about strategies you can do this. You can talk to the person behind the counter with compassion and thankfulness. Such a beautiful day. Thank you for my coffee. This is the highlight, right? This is the highlight of my day that I'm enjoying this moment, right? You can check in when somebody sent a text. Been thinking about you. You don't have to respond to this, but I just want to let you know I care about you. You can do all of these small acts. So I am not asking you to be a super communicator with tons and tons of social contact. Once a month, meeting face to face with people that you deeply care about, prioritizing friendship. Once a week, checking in or talking to somebody. That could be face to face or it could be on the phone. Every single day, treating someone with compassion and having a conversation, and sprinkling throughout your days moments of care and concern for the people around you. And I'm not even asking you to do it for strangers or people who you have no idea. I'm not asking that. I'm asking you to do it with the people who you're already talking to and you already ostensibly like. So I don't think I'm making a big ask, but I feel like the problem of convincing people that social obligation is the right way to live is very, very hard.
Yes, and I think it's just because there's so many other things that are glorified. What we really need is a new Friends TV show, right? Like we need to bring back those were like the best times. Like even the the actors that were on the show, they're like, yeah, they some of the best times of their lives were making the show. Living alone versus living with friends at, in your 20s or 30s is not a bad thing. I mean, you can get a lot out of that. Yeah, I couldn't help but think of the show Friends and how much laughter and fun they took out of everybody. Like, okay, they were not real moments, but they could have been. And
I think there's a reason that Friends and The Office and Sex and the City were as popular as they were and continue to have high viewerships has to do with what you're talking about. People badly want this in their lives, and they look to those media representations to reflect back to them the things that they value, right? What's tricky is that I don't know that those celebrations and those shows actually engender people doing it in their own life as much as I wish that they were.
well, maybe now is the opportunity,
I hope
right?
so.
Because it's a different time and it's a different generation.
I truly hope so.
Hopefully some filmmaker watches this podcast.
Hey, if 10 people watch it, we've already hit a standard
Here we
of my
go.
own.
Yeah. I so much enjoyed our conversation. I thank you also for helping me change my life because I do believe that you have had an impact on mine. I'm curious though, Jeff, is there a question that I didn't ask that you expected me to ask, or that question that you wish that people would ask you but they never do? This would be that time. Did we miss something?
No, I think you didn't miss anything. This has been a delight, and I really enjoyed my conversation with you as well. I would say that the one thing that Andy and I take pride in our book is that we really don't. This is not an attempt to sort of try to make you feel bad about yourself or to be a 10 easy steps. Our reviewers and our people who wrote blurbs for the book said this is one of the few books that really try to understand why you don't, why you're not able to, or you don't feel you have the energy to. And I really feel like if you're looking for a way that's not going to just tell you how to fix your life in a simple way, but offer you a perspective about understanding why it's just so hard right now to make friends and develop our relationships, I feel like this is a book for you. So I hope that compassion we bring that also says people are exhausting and it's really hard to do this is actually the message we need to hear.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it was just great to read it. I'm like, okay, I'm definitely not alone in that thinking, but why? And why should I engage? I think that was a turning point for me in my thinking. Yes, people are exhausting, but I never really realized like the long-term benefits of that, not just for me, but for them too, for people that I care about.
It's what we're giving to other people in our ability to reach out to them, to care for them, spend time with them.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to reading the rest of the book when it comes out.
February 11th. So first, check it out as soon as possible. Yeah.